So if you look at the walls here, you can tell that the artery walls are thicker. The artery walls are thicker, and that makes sense because they're the ones that have to take care of the pressure. Okay, so on the venous side, we have much thinner walls. Okay, now, if you look at the walls of the vessels, there are 3 distinct tissue areas. There are 3 distinct tissue areas, okay, in both vessels. There are 3 distinct tissue areas. The innermost lining is called the tunica interna. Or in some books, the tunica intima. Interna or intima. Then you have the tunica media. What does media mean?
Middle.
Middle. The tunica media is made up primarily of smooth muscle. Smooth muscle. So in some books, this is called the tunica muscularis. And then you have the tunica externa, which in some books is called the tunica adventitia. The tunica externa is pretty much connective tissue. So from looking at this picture, what is the biggest difference that you see between the 2 walls? The media is significantly bigger on the artery side. So that is one of the major differences. The media, or the muscularis, is significantly bigger on the arterial side. Now, if it took 120 milligrams, 120 millimeters of mercury to get your blood all the way out to your toes, how does your blood get back to your heart if it's only under a very small amount of pressure, like 8 millimeters of mercury? Okay, the first way is with valves. Valves are little one-way doors. Valves are little one-way doors. They allow the blood to flow towards the heart and not away from the heart. So when you look at an artery and a vein, the first difference that you see is that the artery has a hugely thicker wall, has a much thicker muscular wall. The second difference that you see is that the veins have valves and the arteries do not. The veins have valves, the arteries do not. Now, something we're going to talk about in more detail in another chapter usually the fluid in your system goes from your arteries through your capillaries and is picked up by the veins and it returns. But remember I said that capillaries leak. If capillaries leak, and that was the end of the story, your tissue spaces would blow up with fluid and you would look like a toad, and there wouldn't be any fluid left in your vascular system. So your body has a way of picking up the fluid that has leaked out of your capillaries and returning it to the vascular system. The way that it does that is with the lymphatic system. And we're going to talk about the lymphatic system in more detail in a different chapter. Now, if you're going to be really picky about it, your conducting vessels or your pressure vessels have different names depending on how far down the system they are. Your big, huge arteries are called conducting vessels because, like the aorta, for example, it's carrying blood to the downstream parts. These large arteries are very elastic. You shove blood into them and they expand, and then when you stop shoving blood into them, they contract. Okay. So these are sometimes called elastic arteries. Downstream, you start having branches to the different body parts. And those are called distributing vessels. So you have the renal artery, for example, to the kidneys, or the carotid artery to the head. Then you get down to the arterioles. The arterioles are also called resistance vessels. Resistance vessels. And that's really important. Arterioles are one of them. They're one of several main reasons, or several main ways that your body controls your blood pressure. The arterioles are one of several main ways that your body controls your blood pressure. The arterioles are sort of the gatekeepers for the capillary beds. If you are laying in a hammock, eating pizza and reading a book, do you need a whole lot of blood flow to your muscles, for example? No. Okay. Where do you need the blood? In your digestive system. Okay. So your body can shunt blood from one area to another depending on what the needs are, what the metabolic needs are in that area of the body. And it can do that by telling the arterioles, okay, cut off the blood supply to that particular capillary bed. Now, your nervous system and your autonomic system do this for you automatically. The capillaries are also called exchange vessels because this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where oxygen diffuses out to supply your tissues. This is where carbon dioxide diffuses back in. This is where nutrients and building block molecules diffuse out, and waste products diffuse back in. And on the other side of the capillaries, you have venules. Venules are collected into your small veins, eventually into your larger veins, which are called capacitance vessels. And finally, you have your big, large veins that are dumping all that blood back into the heart. Remember, capillary beds are tiny. You usually have red blood cells going through here one at a time. Okay. And here you have sphincters of smooth muscle where you can shunt blood wherever it needs to go. Turn off the blood supply to areas and we said that capillaries leak. You have your simple squamous epithelial cells. You have some supporting cells called pericytes. You have a little bit of connective tissue around the outside here. But you also have small clefts or spaces. So, things that are smaller than a red blood cell can diffuse out of those spaces. Anything that's smaller than the space can diffuse out. So oxygen can diffuse out or back in. Carbon dioxide can diffuse in and out. Water can go out, and so forth. Glucose can go out. But big things like red blood cells have to stay in. Big proteins also stay in. Big proteins also stay in. Now, white blood cells circulate to some extent in the blood. When white blood cells get to a place where they are needed, they can crawl out through these clefts. And again, we'll be talking more about that down the road.
Mm-hmm. So should we know the 3 different types of capillaries? Yeah.
Okay. Now, there used to be films, and they were usually done on rabbit ears because it was an easy place to see capillary beds, rabbit ears. But here you have your little capillaries. Okay, Okay, and you can even see there, you know, if you look on, I haven't, but if you look online, they probably still have them down there. You can actually watch the little red blood cells, and they almost have to squeeze to get through the little capillaries, and they go right through there. All right, so if you are trying to water plants, and say you only have one hose bib, we call that thing with water hose bib. Spigot, yeah. So you only have one spigot, but you've got 8 different areas where you need to have water. You can buy an attachment that you can put on your spigot, okay? Or you can put a hose on it and then buy one of those branch things and make 2 hoses and then branch it again, branch it again. If you do that, what's the water pressure going to be like once you've got all of these branches?
Very low.
Very, very low. Okay. The same thing happens with the blood flow in your vessels. You start out with a systemic blood pressure of about 120. That's when the ventricles actually shove in blood into the system. The pressure never drops to 0, even after the ventricle quits shoving. The reason for that is because the arteries, which have expanded, now they begin to contract, and they're putting pressure on that blood. The ventricular pressure went down to almost 0. The ventricles relaxed. But the arteries are still pressing on that blood. So when the ventricle is contracting, you have your systolic pressure. When the ventricle is relaxing, you have your diastolic pressure. The diastolic pressure is being created by the arteries. But as you go from these large vessels down to smaller and smaller vessels, you are branching, and then you're branching again, and then you're branching some more. And every time you do, the pressure falls. Just like every time you put another hose on your system, pressure falls. Eventually you get down to the arterioles, and by that time, the pressure is almost gone. Okay. In the capillary beds, you have very little pressure. And then in the veins, you have very little pressure. Okay. Now, that's a good thing because capillaries are fairly delicate. Veins, as we saw, are not as robust as arteries. So if you had too much pressure here, you would blow them to smithereens. But it brings up the question, how does this blood get all the way back out to the heart? If it took this much pressure to shove it out to the periphery in the first place, how does it get back with only that amount of pressure? And we've already given one answer to that. What was our one answer?
The valves.
The valves. Okay. And some of you mentioned the second thing that helps with the process, and that is the muscular pump. So the valves and the muscular pump work together. When muscles contract, they squeeze on the veins that are adjacent to them. They squeeze on the veins that are adjacent to them, and the blood in those veins moves. Which direction does it move? Towards the heart. Why? It can't go back the other way because the veins are in the way. Okay, so when the muscles squeeze on the veins, they squeeze the fluid in those veins along, but it can only go one way because of the valves. Now, remember we said that the veins can hold extra blood. One of the conditions which will cause the veins to hold extra blood is when there's not a whole lot of muscle contraction going on. Another thing that will shove more blood into the veins is when you are very hot. Remember, the dermis contains both arteries and veins, and your skin helps get rid of heat. That heat gets there in those blood vessels and in those veins. If the veins in the skin expand, that allows more heat to escape. So under hot conditions, your body will send more blood to the skin. What if you are on a parade ground, or you're standing in the OR and you're scared to death because everybody's saying, "Don't move." And you're not moving around with your muscles. And then you get hot. Either it's 100 degrees on the parade ground and you're trying to stand in attention, or you're hot because you've got all this junk on in the OR and you're scared. What happens? You pass out. Why? No, it's not because you overheat.
The blood is leaving all the extra bleeding.
Yeah, your blood is still being pumped, okay? But if it's all being pumped into your venous system and it's not getting back to your to your heart, so you pump it to the head, you're going to pass out. So how do you keep that from happening? Fidget. There you go. Okay, you fidget. Okay. Now, if you're on a parade ground or if you're in the OR, okay, and they're saying, "Don't move," okay, how do you fidget without anybody knowing that you're going to do it? Okay, doing it with your fingers isn't going to work. You need your large muscles. Okay. Well, in the OR, you can always stand on one foot and then stand on the other foot, that kind of thing. On the parade ground, you make sure that you do not lock your knees. Okay. Remember, your knees aren't stable. Okay. If you lock your knees, bend them all the way back, lock them, okay, they're more stable. If you don't lock them, they're not stable. And the only thing that is holding your knee is your large muscles. So when your knees are not locked, your large muscles have to contract. And they have to compensate. How can you tell when someone's standing when their knees are not locked? Because they may sway a little bit, okay, as their muscles compensate. Okay? That helps to keep you from passing out. So if you ever have a chance to scrub in on surgery, that's what you do. Make sure you move your feet around. Keep that blood pumping. Okay? So those are two of the ways that blood gets returned to the heart: the muscular pump and the valves. Okay? The third way is with the respiratory pump. The respiratory pump. And we're going to go into more detail with the respiratory pump. Down the road when we talk about the respiratory system. For now, what you need to know is that the thoracic cavity and the diaphragm act an awful lot like a syringe. you pull back the plunger on a syringe, it creates a vacuum, correct? And that's why whatever you've got the syringe attached to, why that will flow into the syringe, because you've created a little vacuum. Your diaphragm acts just like a little plunger on a syringe. And when the diaphragm contracts, it's like pulling the plunger on the syringe. It creates a little bit of a vacuum inside the thoracic cavity, and that sucks in blood from the venous system. So you have your muscular pump, your respiratory pump, and your veins. That's how your body gets the blood back from the periphery to the heart. Okay, now don't sweat the numbers here. When you go to grad school, you can sweat the numbers. We use several different measures for pressure in physiology. The most common one is millimeters of mercury. That's what we measure blood pressure in. Millimeters of mercury. So you will see all of these are in millimeters of mercury as well. Now, there's something to understand here. The pressure coming into the capillary, you have water pressure because the blood is mostly water, and you've got more blood stacked up behind the blood that's entering your capillary. Make sense? So there's going to be a little bit of pressure here just because there's blood coming along behind this other blood. That pressure is called hydrostatic pressure. Hydrostatic from the water in the blood. So which way would you expect things to leak if you have hydrostatic pressure coming into your capillary? Which way would things leak? Out. That's what we usually think of leaking. Something goes out. Okay. So hydrostatic pressure on this end of the capillary is enough to cause things to leak out of the capillary.
Can you define hydrostatic pressure?
It's the pressure from water coming behind here. Now, impress me. What's the quick and dirty definition of osmosis? Water follows the particles. On this end of the capillary, you've had water leaking out. So on this end of the capillary, you have less water and more particles that couldn't get out, correct? You have your red blood cells that couldn't get out. You have your albumin proteins that couldn't get out. Yes? Okay. So on this end, you have hydrostatic pressure still, but now you have more osmotic pressure. So what's the water going to do on that end? It's going to come back in. Okay. The osmotic pressure is going to draw the water back in on this side. Okay,
Isn't the water, did you see my face?
Yeah.
Isn't the water from the hydrostatic pressure going in, forcing things out?
Yeah, exactly.
So the osmotic pressure is also letting water come in. So it's just different size. Okay.
Okay, now Corey, important part here. Which way is the water moving up here with the osmotic pressure? And that is where? In or out?
Out to in. What?
Yes,
Yeah.
out to in.
Yeah.
Okay. Here you're going in to out.
Uh-huh.
Here you're going out to in.
Yeah.
There you go. Okay. So that's one reason why you don't blow up as a toad. When you have stuff leaking out your capillaries. The other reason is you have your lymphatic system. Okay? Now, they know what a normal amount of leakage is. The hydrostatic pressure here is always a little more than our osmotic pressure. So there is always a net leak that stays out in the tissue spaces. How do they know that? They measured it. Okay, let's take a break and come back and talk about blood pressure.